Hello?
Hello?
Hello, hello.
If you want, we could just use the regular. Oh, wait.
Microphone used to
Now
be
can
on
you hear
here.
me?
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
All right.
Usually the defaults come up just fine, but every once in a while it has a mind of its own.
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us time to interview you for our
Yes.
podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You bet. Happy to.
All right. Real quick, would you like to introduce yourself? Because we are recording this.
Okay, very good. So my name is Dr. Jeff Meldrum, and I'm a professor of anatomy and anthropology in the Department of Biological Sciences at Idaho State University, where I teach human gross anatomy and the health professions programs and do research into the evolutionary history of the evolution of hominin bipedalism, how we came to be adapted to walking on two legs. And it's from that perspective that my interest in the possible existence of and the evidence for the possible existence of another bipedal hominin took shape.
Thank you. We just had some questions we wanted to ask you
Okay,
about Bigfoot. Okay, I just want to
certainly.
start. What was the moment when you decided Bigfoot was real? This is what you wanted to research.
Oh, well, it usually doesn't occur as just in a momentary flash. I mean, there were events that planted seeds that synergized with other interests that I had as a youngster. I was always very interested in natural history and in biology and especially in evolutionary biology, primate studies, paleoanthropology, the human fossil record. Um, and so it was against that backdrop that I first was exposed to the Patterson-Gimlin film back in 1968. And shortly after it had been captured in the autumn of '67, I was about 11 years old in fifth grade. And so that interest waxed and waned over the years, certainly was influenced by other experiences and so forth. But then I ended up in a career path that put me in a position where, when that interest was rekindled through exposure to new evidence, in particular, well, two things happened kind of in tandem. One, I was asked to evaluate a piece of video evidence that was really quite intriguing. Wasn't the best quality. It wasn't certainly didn't rise to the quality of the Patterson-Gimlin film, but there are enough little clues embedded in it to really pique my curiosity, my interest, and so shortly thereafter, I had a chance to visit the lab of Dr. Grover Krantz at Washington State University. He was the principal academic face of the subject of Bigfoot at that time, and had his focus likewise was very centered on the footprint evidence. That's what had convinced him. We don't like to use the word believe, because that, as a scientist, that has a in the layperson's vernacular, that has a connotation of the acceptance of something in the absence of evidence, a conviction held just sort of emotionally or irrationally, basically.
Right.
Whereas if you're convinced, I mean, it's the evidence that has convinced me. And so after that visit to his lab, I had a chance to swing down and pay a surprise visit to a personality I had encountered in writing a book review of a little book that focused on evidence from the area of southeastern Washington. And he, to make a long story short, took us out. I was traveling with my younger brother, took us out to a site where he had just found footprints that morning. It seemed just too coincidental, but he made the habit, as the snows melted off the foothill roads, he would drive these roads, and these muddy tracks would or muddy roadways. They were basically just graded roads with no gravel improvements, tertiary quality roads. The footprints were very clear. very fresh. A Sasquatch had walked by there just last night or in the wee hours of that morning. And so that, if I had to put my finger on, one experience, that was what really set the hook. I mean, as far I because knowing what I know, having the experience and expertise in the evaluation of hominin footprints and modern human foot form and function, the significance of this evidence, not a single footprint, but a long line, 35, 45 clear footprints in the mud that show all the dynamics and variation from step to step. That, I could understand what was there, what the signal was. And so it was like, they do. I mean, I guess there was a flip or a switch flipped in a way, because that was a bit of an aha moment that they do exist. My gosh, a Sasquatch just walked by here. And so now, at that time, I made 7 plaster casts as well as dozens and dozens of photographs and such. And then now I have over 300 footprint casts in my lab. Not only North America and Canada, but even other types of relic hominoids like the Yeti or the Almas or the Orang-Pendek and so on. So it's been a fascinating trip.
Do you have a plastic cast with you now?
Yeah, just give me a second.
Ooh, I'd love to see that.
So, yeah.
Here's a particularly clear example because the conditions were just really quite remarkable.
Oh, wow.
A little bit here. The location was a construction site, a logging landing with heavy equipment. The dirt was very compacted, very hard pan, but with a layer of pulverized dust on top of it, which had been wet down by the rain. And so when the foot stepped in that mud, that 2 inches of mud, and pressed right down all the way to the, and I mean, it just extruded around the edges, as you can see, up between the toes. So the outline of the foot, there's even indications of some arthritis in the joints of the outer part of the foot, maybe an injury or just aging. We see actually this feature in a number of different examples. I think are older individuals, but this would probably represent a big male, a footprint on the order of 17 inches, about 5 inches across the heel. So it probably stood 8.5 feet tall, 1,200 to 1,500 pounds.
Gee, that's
the size of a moose.
Yeah.
Think about it. That's the size of a moose.
Yeah.
And so it's these are. I mean, I think they're Pleistocene relics. I think this is part of the Ice Age megafauna that has managed to survive because of the more moderate environmental changes that took place in the forest environments, as opposed to the other regions of the biosphere, and with the transitions between the ice ages and the Holocene. So yeah.
So you mentioned aging. Have you guys like found any evidence on like how much these guys like ate, like what do they age to, like
Like their life expectancy and so forth?
yeah.
Well, there's some indirect evidence. We have some situations, some examples where, say, a particular individual, I mean, a foot shape and toe configuration provides a pretty distinctive signature of an individual. If we had everyone in your class strip their shoes and socks off and put their feet up in a row with just a little bit of practice and examination and so forth, a couple measurements, you could pretty much associate a footprint with another person and single them out. And so if you randomly picked one student and had them come in and leave some tracks, with the notes you had taken or pictures you had taken, you could probably match those footprints up to the foot that made the tracks pretty readily. So the point is, I think that just to demonstrate that it is possible to recognize repeat appearances of a particular individual in a given area. And given their rarity, you wouldn't have to be comparing it to 30 students. It might just be 6 or 7,
Right.
because in a given area, there aren't going to be very many. So the chances you find footprints repeatedly in an area, the chance of one or another individual repeatedly leaving recognizable footprints is pretty good. Now, based on that, we've got examples, records of adults whose footprints had been found over a 20-year span. So if they're aging at least as fast as humans, and perhaps faster if they're a more primitive kind of more ape-like creature, then they probably reach maturity and adult body size by the age of about 12 to 14, maybe. So that individual whose footprints we had seen repeatedly probably was on the order of between 30 and 40 years old. I think that if we look at life expectancy of humans and other great apes, of which they constitute our family, the hominoidea, the life expectancy before we have artificially exaggerated our lifespan with medicine and with good nutrition, healthcare, and so forth. In the old days, centuries ago, life expectancy was 45 to 65. No one ever lived past 60, 65, or rarely. And same with gorillas and chimps and orangutans. The oldest gorilla right now in captivity is 65 years old. But see, that's been a little bit exaggerated because they have veterinary care, they have good food, they're protected, and so forth. So 45 to 55 is probably, there's a positive correlation of increased longevity with increased body size too. Bigger animals live longer than small animals that have a higher metabolic rate and burn themselves out faster. And so a big animal like a Sasquatch, which is about at least half again, if not twice as big as a male gorilla, are probably living a little bit longer. So I'd say easily 55 to 65 years old. And that's a good question too, because it also bears on another common question: where are the bodies? Why don't we find remains? Well, as I mentioned, they're very rare. It doesn't take as many to maintain a population because they're at the top of their food chain. They have a long life expectancy. They probably reproduce infrequently, which is the case with the non-human apes. Humans have bucked that trend. It used to be that if a woman had a baby and was nursing, that suppressed the ovulation of any more eggs until that she was weaning her offspring. So you weren't trying to take care of two infants, very dependent infants at the same time. But humans have kind of messed that up, or not messed it up. What's the word I'm after? They have changed that system so that now nursing does tend to suppress ovulation, but it's not reliable as a form of birth control. So women can get pregnant, right away. So you can have a baby almost on an annual basis, like a bear. Bear drops usually a couple of cubs every season, but an orangutan only has a baby every 6 to 8 years.
Oh.
So they're not as numerous. A death is a really rare event. And so there just aren't bodies around. I mean, when you compare to something like deer, I was talking to one friend of mine who I worked in the field with, had a friend who was in the Department of Natural Resources up in Minnesota. And he asked him this question. He goes, how many deer die every winter? And he said between 10 and 20,000 just in the state of Minnesota. But you're not tripping over deer every time you go on a hike every spring. Over carcasses and stepping on bones. I mean, things get processed. So when you have a top predator like the Sasquatch, where there's a death in a state like Idaho, maybe once every 10 years, that body gets decomposed, gets recycled with gnawers and chewers and decomposers and scavengers, and bits and pieces are quickly rendered. If not by living things, then the soils in wet coniferous forests tend to be very acidic, which tends to uh, leach the minerals out of the bone and they decompose and break down very rapidly.
I have another question,
Yeah.
and I think I've been confused about this, and I have a feeling that other people will be too.
Mhm.
So there is more than one,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Some people labor under this misconception that it's a lone, wretched monster. See, and then it's easy to simply dismiss it as just a fairy tale, just a legend. But the evidence suggests, like I brought out one footprint, I have 300 examples, and some of those are 4 inches long and go right on up through.
Oh, so like baby Bigfoot.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we have evidence of different ages, different genders. I think because the females, like you see the picture behind me, the footprints from that film site. She is definitely a female. Her footprint measures just under 15 inches, but it's very narrow. Not very narrow. I mean, it's narrower than this one. And you see how this one, how it's much broader across the forefoot than it is across the heel, even though the heel is massive too, compared to a human. A human of this size would have a heel maybe, about like that. Even if I've always wanted to get a cast of somebody like Shaquille O'Neal, who's a big, not just tall and skinny, well, Sidner, Primo, Abdul-Jabbar, but Shaq has, I think he probably has a triple E. But humans generally, even ones that achieve that 6 to 7 foot height range, rarely larger than that, have very narrow feet and usually fall arches and pronated ankles and so on. But so the point I was making is her footprint is more parallel sided. It doesn't have this flaring. So the males who are bigger and have more mass, because mass increases, geometrically, and so the foot, which is only in 2 dimensions, it doesn't quite keep up as well with increased linear dimensions. And so males have broader feet for more surface area. And then the other way to compensate is to walk with flexed knees and hips, what we call a compliant gait. So there's less force of heel strike and toe, concentrating the forces in restricted areas of the foot. So we've got evidence of males and females, and young ones, and there are reports of individuals who appear to be grayed with kind of grizzled or frosted hair or gray coloration leaching out of the color. So those aren't seen as often. Those older probably are less ambitious about contact with humans and probably stay back in the backcountry. I think a lot of our encounters are oftentimes young ones. Don't have young males that don't have a territory to defend yet, and they are interested and curious about and more bold in their decision making, interacting with people. So that's just speculation.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said top of the food chain, and they have areas they protect. Are they carnivores or are they like omnivores?
They're probably omnivore. Yeah, there are sightings of them eating everything from roots and berries to deer and elk, and actively hunting them, not just looking for scavenged corpses, but there are reports of by witnesses who see Sasquatch ambushing deer and twisting their necks, corkscrewing their.
Oh wow,
Yeah.
cool. That's aggressive hunting.
But they don't have claws. They don't have big fangs. They don't have the projecting canines. They've got squared off teeth because their adaptation is primarily, when you have interlocking canines, that limits the ability for this side to side grinding, what we call the phase two, the bite cycle. And phase one is the up and down part, but phase two is when the teeth come into contact, then they slide past each other. The cusps drag down through the basins and crush the food that's been sliced by the crests and ridges in the initial part of the chew. But to do that, you reduce the canines so they're butting end to end and they don't hinder that side to side movement. So most reports of Bigfoot, and their depiction in native art, it shows the teeth squared off in stark contrast to the way they, would depict a bear with ears on top of their heads and canines interlocking. So they're massive jaws and they're big. I mean, if you use her as an example, and this is what's interesting. I mean, this film was 1967. This was before we really understood much about some of these specialized adaptations that we see in the robust early hominins that really specialized in these coarse diets. And they had these squared off canines, they had massive premolars and molars, they had these flaring cheekbones with huge masseter muscles, and then of course they had a small brain that wasn't much bigger than modern chimp or gorilla. So they often had a crest like big gorillas do today to provide more attachment for the temporalis muscle here that attaches to the jaw underneath that zygomatic arch. So those are the two most visible muscles, the temporalis and the masseter, and the size and attachment on the Sasquatch seems to support the notion that they exhibit this kind of, we call it durophagus. They have a tough, durable. Duro means hard, tough food items, and so have adaptations for that. But that wasn't understood. I mean, the first doctoral dissertation where a graduate student really grappled with these biomechanics and these new fossils that were being discovered in the 70s, that was first published in early 82 or 84. So what you see on the film, that's what's so fascinating, is what you see on that film in 1967 didn't make a lot of sense to people, but it actually anticipated what we now understand, but only 50 years later. And so it really anticipated these later discoveries that have proven, in my mind, they just reinforce the fact that, that's exactly how we envision, with the exception of the large size, which I think came during the Pleistocene, when so many mammals were getting bigger and bigger, to be able to exploit the northern latitudes that were colder and colder. A big body size allows you to, less metabolic energy necessary to maintain core temperature. And that's why the animals, one of the reasons they got bigger. The other was to make room for a larger gut to digest more vegetative matter. And as the prey species got bigger, the predators got bigger to take advantage of them. And so I think Sasquatch was just the primate representative that got pulled along with this trend for gigantism. And that's why we find them primarily in temperate forests rather than in jungles of Africa or Southeast Asia.
I also want to go back a little bit.
Yeah.
You said you believe, or you're convinced they come from the Ice Age, right?
Well, I mean, they went through that period. I think we can certainly trace their origins back even further, whether it's to something like Gigantopithecus, or, as I've made many allusions, it might be a relic hominin species, something similar to a robust Australopithecine that had maybe spread out of Africa and through Southern Asia, and then during the Pleistocene exploited more northern latitude expansion of the taiga with forests.
Thank you.
I have a question about the name. So you use Sasquatch. Is that the scientific term, or?
No. Bigfoot was popularized when footprints turned up in Northern California in the late 50s and early 60s. And it was simply as mundane as someone saying, "Man, that's a Bigfoot." And it stuck. Sasquatch is a term that was coined by a journalist and teacher, J.W. Burns, who lived up in Canada, Vancouver Island, or no, British Columbia, the mainland of British Columbia. And he was fascinated by the stories, by the lore and the tradition of these wild men of the woods. And each tribe, of course, had its own name, that many of which sounded similar to one another because of the affinity of the languages. And so he coined a term that was just a little easier for white guys to say, namely Sasquatch, but which then, loosely means the wild man or wild people of the woods. Now that as that suggests, every indigenous tribe has their own particular name, and some of them are quite descriptive. The eaters of the cockle shells, or cockles. They find cockle shells piled up where they then harvesting the shellfish on the shore. Or they have other names for them that describe aspects of their behavior. But the most common theme is that they're the wild men of the woods. They inhabit the areas where the people, the humans, don't go usually, and they have mutual respect. Presumably, in the traditions suggest they have mutual respect, kind of live and let live attitude. But there are also examples in Asia, all the way over from Siberia, the easternmost Siberia, down through Southeast Asia, over up along the Himalayas, clear up to the Caucasus Mountains to the west, in western Russia, creatures that have footprints and that are described remarkably similar. I mean, it's almost certain that's where the North American Sasquatch had its origin. It is from an Asian. People don't realize 75% of the mammals that we typically think of as native to North America are actually immigrants from Asia across the land bridge, as well as the other direction. Many species expanded across that intermittent connection between the continents. So there's that. But the only reason I went down this path is I wanted to make the distinction that there are other man-like monsters, anthropomorphic creatures described that might be different, like the Yeti, the abominable snowman. Its footprint looks very different. It looks like a chunky chimpanzee with a divergent big toe and short, thick lateral digits, but it's probably still climbing in trees, living in the high valleys of the Himalayas that are choked with temperate subtropical forest. And we see their footprints in the snow when they cross over the passes between adjacent valleys. There are creatures in Western Asia that look remarkably like the fossilized footprints of Neanderthals from cave sites in Europe and Asia. And where these stories of the Almasti, they're called, which are only about 5.5 feet tall, have differentiated head hair, their bodies are generally covered with hair. They have stone tools. They wear sometimes furs. They're considered just backwards people by the local indigenous tribal peoples, but they are reported from areas where fossils and archaeological remains of Neanderthals have been documented. And it may be that they are relic populations of Neanderthals that haven't gone entirely extinct. Recently, there was the discovery of a little person who was nicknamed the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, particularly on the island of Flores. And isn't it funny that the people who discovered these fossils that were only tens of thousands of years old, they go, well, yeah, actually, the local people have been telling us stories about little people, little hairy people who live up in the mountains, in the very areas where these fossils are being found. An analysis of the cranial remains and skeletal remains indicate a very primitive hominin, perhaps a relic Australopithecus of some type. So we now know that the tree is very, very bushy, the family tree of humans and great apes. And there are many different branches that were contemporaneous across the ape at any given time. And several of those branches, we have fossils that now are much younger than we ever would have thought would have been the case just a few decades ago. The Hobbit was a sensation, and I used it to good effect in part and others did as well. The managing editor of Nature Journal, Nature Magazine, wrote an editorial. He said this was just a sensation, and in fact, it sort of sparked new interest in the reports of other man-like creatures like the Bigfoot and the Yeti. He said maybe it's time for cryptozoology to come in out of the cold. But, a little ripple is all it made, but still, it's like there's just too much inertia, and until physical remains are found, it's well, any number of scenarios could be imagined, from a hunter just shooting one to a truck driver hitting one on a rural highway, or a spelunker coming out of a cave, a limestone cave with the skull of a Sasquatch.
Oh, that'd be cool. Find a Sasquatch skull.
Yeah, that would be quite amazing.
Hmm.
Then we could really start an investigation, a study to try to learn more about them. It's not going to become any easier suddenly just because someone, a bone materializes. So they're still going to remain elusive and extremely difficult to encounter and let alone observe for the time. One could hope.
I just have one more question for
Yeah.
you. Are Sasquatches nocturnal, or are they like I'm curious about their hunting patterns. If you know anything about that.
Exactly. And there's been a lot of discussion. One interesting observation that was made, quite some time ago. John Green is an author and journalist, and has really, he's deceased now, but had taken a real interest in this subject matter. And he did a lot of data collection back in the pre-internet era. And so it was hard won information. But one of the things that he concluded from his sort of analysis, his descriptive statistical analysis, was there were as many reports at night as there were reports during the day. And so it suggested there wasn't an exclusive nocturnal or diurnal habits. But he also said, given the limitations of human visibility and activity outside in the dark, that would suggest that if there are that many encounters, the Bigfoot must be pretty active during that period of time. Or who knows, or maybe they're attracted by the lights and the sounds and smells to people going about their business in the dark. Appearing in their reports of them peeking in windows in cabins, wanting to see what's going on. They want to watch the sitcom. So I don't think that we know. We do. I mean, I think it's very unlikely that they are adapted to nocturnality, in that one of the characteristics of higher primates is the loss of the reflecting membrane, the tapetum back there. But there are examples amongst the primates, a couple in particular, the tarsiers and the night monkeys or owl monkeys of South America, both of which have secondarily become nocturnal in their behaviors, but they had already relinquished that reflecting membrane in favor of a focal point, a fovea centralis, that makes sharp vision and especially color vision much more effective. But what they do then to aid them to see at night is they've grossly increased the size of the eyes. So a little tarsier, which is kind of looks like a little frog with hair and a tail, their one eyeball is almost as big as their entire brain. The night monkeys have eyes that are about 50% at least bigger than usual for a monkey of their size. So if Sasquatch, in its increase in size, if the eyes have simply scaled up, oftentimes animals that are big, the relative size of their eyes, think of a whale or think of an elephant. They've got this massive head and this itty bitty little eye here because that's all they need to see with, But if the eyes got big with the increased body size, then it would be the same strategy used by the tarsier or the night monkey. The light gathering capacity of the eye would be greatly increased, and their ability to see at night would be tremendously enhanced over hours. And so I think that is more. And some witnesses have commented on how big and dark colored their eyes were. I think they were seeing these very large, eyes with very dilated pupils for the uptake of the ambient light. So those are again some speculation, analogy, modeling. But it should leave you with the notion that it's very reasonable that they could be well adapted to getting around at night and taking advantage of it. And then that might be one way in which they partition the habitat with other omnivores like bears. Bears are particularly active at dawn and dusk. So if a Sasquatch could be active in the dead of night as well as in the daytime, then their chances of bumping into bears or having a competition for the same resources would be lessened. I think that Sasquatch have different strategies that help them to partition and niche themselves as well. One being, we talked about the chewing. That's very different than the adaptations of a bear, which still have the canines, still have little tiny premolars and molars, although they're bigger than a dog, because they're probably evolved from a dog-like ancestor, carnivore ancestor. They have a very simple gut with a very small, large intestine or colon. If Sasquatch is derived from an ape, it probably has a gut anatomy and physiology that allows it to eat and digest things that a bear couldn't digest at all. If they've got a big hind gut colon where all the fermentation of vegetative matter takes place, then they would be able to utilize, leaves and shoots and sedges and vegetative moss, vegetative matter that wouldn't be of much benefit to a bear because they just couldn't digest it and just be rubbish.
Hello.
Okay.
There you go. Sorry, we had to move a location.
Yeah.
Yeah. Quick. No problem at all. No problem.
All right, we just had 2 more questions for you.
Okay. Right.
You based a lot of your evidence on a scientific basis, right? And I have an uncle who believes Bigfoot is a supernatural creature.
Right.
I just want to know your opinion on that.
Well, you never say never, but if there is one principle which in this case is applicable, it is what is called the principle of parsimony, and I'm often a critic of the misuse of that principle, sometimes known as Occam's razor, which is erroneously stated or paraphrased as the simplest answer is most likely the correct one. That's not what Occam's razor says. It says that in order to, by the strict philosophical approach to scientific inquiry, it's acknowledged that you can't possibly test every possible situation or case. And so since that's impossible, what you try to do is come up with one exception. Anything that contradicts your hypothesis, this is called falsification. Well, in order to, and then when you falsify your hypothesis, then you go back to the drawing board and you make it more elaborate, or you alter it in such a way that it accommodates your new evidence. Well, the Karl Popper, who coined this principle, he said that you shouldn't unnecessarily multiply factors in your explanation. In other words, if you're going to, in an orderly fashion, test your hypotheses and advance by falsifying a hypothesis, it makes sense to start with the simplest. Hence the expression not to unnecessarily multiply factors. In other words, you're not justified in jumping to a real elaborate, complicated explanation until you've shown that the simpler one can be rejected, that it's insufficient. So with that in mind, as a biologist looking at the evidence for Sasquatch, I see things, and I've only experienced firsthand things that can be accommodated within a hypothesis that Bigfoot is a species of relic hominoid that evolved and is adapted to life on this planet, in particular forest habitats. That doesn't mean that it's not possible. There are portals, or there are shapeshifters, or there are, energy vibrations and frequencies that allow an organism to change and move through dimensions and planes of existence. Those things are possible, but I have to ask, well, why would Sasquatch, which the old expression, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. If Sasquatch appears to be adapted as a large bipedal ape, it looks so remarkably similar to the fossil record we have of large bipedal apes and early hominins. Why would it be the only forest creature out there that is ever encountered that is stepping through portals or is turning into a bouncing ball of light, and so on? And so for me, I can't justify those very subjective, elaborate, fanciful explanations when I can explain what I've experienced, what I've studied, what I've personally seen, and what other credible witnesses have consistently seen, rather than the outliers. When I can accommodate that as a biological species of primate. So that's kind of where I come down on it. I've been invited out by people. I've pressed people who experience these things. When I go out with them, nothing happens. So I get accused of having a bad spirit, I've dampened, I'm the wet blanket. But on the other hand, there was one guy, for example, who was going on and on and on about orbs, that orbs associated with his interactions with Bigfoot. And I go, well, do you have any pictures? I mean, can you substantiate your experience? Oh, sure. And I said, all right, send me the best example you have. Don't send me one thing, and when I criticize it, say you've got better. Put your best foot forward and send me the best picture. So he sends me a picture. Well, it sends me a picture on the computer. And it was a nighttime flash photograph. And it was, if you've ever been out in the woods when especially like the big ponderosa pine trees that produce so much pollen that it's just floating around like a blizzard, you go out at night and take a picture, or even if you just go out with your headlamp on to use the bathroom, you can't see anything because it's a whiteout. The light bounces off all of these pollen grains. And that was what his picture was on. And I said, now let me make sure, are we on the same page? You're calling all these little dots of light orbs. Yeah, that's right, he said. That's pollen. That's pollen from the trees, and your flash is just bouncing off. Oh, no, it's orbs. It's energy balls. Yeah. Anyway, so that's kind of where I'm at on it. I think it'd be fascinating. Wouldn't it be interesting if we discovered a creature who could, like
cool.
open up a portal? It would be really weird. It would be fascinating, but I mean, that's the problem. It doesn't seem to fit, and there's no documentation. That's the thing. My interest, my involvement has focused on this, and as a result, it's something that it's a trace. Yes, it's not a physical piece of a body, but it's something that we can heft, we can put calipers on and measure it, we can photograph it, we can scan it, we can compare it to more examples, we can look for patterns that emerge, we can talk about demographics of populations and so on. It's real science, real data.
You have a question?
I got one more question for you.
Okay.
Do you think Bigfoot or Sasquatches have ever tried or have hunted humans before in the past, whether out of desperation for food or just in general?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there have been a couple of instances of sort of classic stories, like here in Idaho, not up on the border with Montana in the Bitterroot Mountains. There's one classic tale that has kind of gone with a lot of attention because it was first publicized by none other than Teddy Roosevelt, and he heard the story firsthand from one of the two men involved, the survivor. The two fur trappers, were up on the Bitterroot Range in the backcountry between Idaho and Montana, and they were accosted by a creature which they antagonized by shooting at it, whereupon it dispatched one of them. The other hightailed it out with what he could grab and lived to tell the story. The other story that often gets cited, it's kind of a classic from back in the 1930s, almost 100 years ago now, the giant hairy apes of Mount St. Helens, where these prospectors had an encounter, several encounters with mountain devils, and reportedly shot one that tumbled over the precipice into the canyon, whereupon their cabin was pelted with rocks and stones. I mean, it sometimes invokes images of these giant apes heaving boulders onto the roof of the cabin, but it probably wasn't that. They were just attacking the cabin, pounding on the walls, pelting it with rocks. Anyway, but the interesting thing about both those stories is it was the human that instigated the antagonist. They shot it.
So they will fight back. They will fight back for sure.
Yeah, seems to be the case. Yeah.
Which makes sense as top of the food chain.
Any large animal usually does that, defending themselves or defending their offspring or their mate or their territory or a food source. But the vast majority of encounters are very mundane. Bigfoot sees Sasquatch, or eyewitness sees Bigfoot, or vice versa, going opposite directions. Not very many scary stories.
No, not very many.
Yeah.
Well, again, more questions, Aaron?
I think so. Yeah. So during our research, we had a little trouble understanding the reproduction, and we almost came to the conclusion that it was an asexual creature.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah. Well, they, as I said, if you look closely at her nickname is Patty for a reason. That's taken largely from the Patterson, Roger Patterson, who captured the film. But she is of the size and the disposition. She has visible breasts that would suggest that she is a female. There have been, on rare instances, descriptions of the male external genitalia, but those have been rare. One of the interesting ones was Albert Ostman was a Canadian, and you may have heard this story, this classic story. He was out on vacation, and for him, vacationing was hiking around in the mountains, prospecting for lost gold mines. That was his avocation. Well, he had a run-in with a Bigfoot who, during the night, hoisted him up in his backpack like a gunny sack and carried him off to this distant location where there was a hidden valley, a box canyon, and he was kind of held captive, held at bay for several days. But when he was interviewed afterwards, one of the people who interviewed him was Dr. Darius Swindler, who was a primate anatomist at University of Washington. And they overlapped sufficiently. Dr. Swindler was able to interview him. And that was one of the things he commented on, was that his description of the male genitalia of a large ape was very accurate. And he goes, he said, if he's faking this, if he's making it up, he must have done a lot of research, because a lot of that information is not generally known to the public, especially back then, before the days of National Geographic documentaries of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey and such. So the clues, we talked a little bit about area and so forth and territory. The clues suggest that they are rather solitary. Most of the sightings, most of the footprints are of single individuals, solitary individuals, or what are interpreted as females with offspring in tow. The closest comparison, I think, is to the orangutan, where the male dominates a territory that overlaps the home ranges of several females. The male broadcasts his position, his presence, and his position as the top ape on the block by loud calls. And as I said, they only give birth every 6 to 8 years. So when the females are receptive to the male's attention, they seek out the company of the male. Unless they bump into a bachelor, another bachelor. I say that because there have actually been some genetic studies of the offspring in the home range of a male, and they find that only about 60 to 70% of the offspring are sired by the dominant male. That some of the young males successfully mate with the females and produce offspring. Anyway, the apes that have that kind of strategy, whether it's the orangutan that defends the real estate, or it's the like a gorilla that monopolizes a harem, they have very inconspicuous external genitalia, because the size of their testicles are small, relatively small. They don't have to produce a lot of spermatozoa because they have no competition. They are the only ones that have access to the female. And so that, again, I pointed out, it's interesting that in most encounters with Bigfoot, because again, talking about monster movies, big teeth, claws, and or sometimes, impressive genitalia are features of a monster figure. And those are all gone from Sasquatch. They don't have it. So that to me is remarkably consistent with, again, the biological explanation of a large-bodied ape that in fact reflects aspects of its social behavior that are consistent with comparisons to apes that have similar aspects of their behavior. See, now you look at chimpanzees, especially bonobos, where the males, there is no exclusive access. And so what do? They have an arms race. A bonobo, a pygmy chimp, has a pair of testicles. We were talking about the eyes of the tarsier being as big as their brain. A bonobo boasts a testicle that's almost as big as its brain.
That's funny.
And so, it's in nuclear arms, we call that mutual destruction, mutual annihilation. In this case, it's just overpowering your neighbor by producing more sperm than they do. And so this is selecting for ever bigger and bigger and bigger stockpiles of ICBMs.
Well, Aaron, any more questions?
I think that's it.
That's
Okay.
it. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah,
Jeff
thank you so
Meldrum.
much for coming
Welcome.
on here.
It's been an honor.
Well,
I'm glad
likewise.
you showed up on this.
It's been fun. So I would just add, then the takeaway message from all of this, we get kind of silly here with the reproduction discussion, but the point that is so significant is we can have a conversation about reproductive strategies and social structure based on not just mere speculation, but rather there are evidences, there are clues from observations, independent observations, that can be compared by analogy, by comparative method to our nearest neighbors, their nearest neighbors, the great apes, to look for remarkable parallels. And that's what's amazing, whether it's the distribution, the habitat, shared with black bears, for example, whether it's the social structure correlated with the anatomy that you see, whether it's the lack of stone tools and evidence from the rare handprints that we have that they don't have a very well-developed opposable thumb for precision grip. Their hand is more like a paw with the thumb facing in the same direction. And so they don't have the musculature for fine precision grip. All that correlates really well with their lack of tools. There is a biological, an ecological, a behavioral basis, context for so much of what has been described and attributed to Sasquatch or observed about their anatomy and behavior that makes it a good biological model, a good biological species, and we don't have to resort to paranormal explanations to account for those anatomies and behaviors. In fact, it doesn't make sense that they would have those features. Anyway, have fun with it, and hope it'll lead to more and more questions.
Oh, I'm
course.
sure it will. This was very interesting.
This is really fun.
This was.
All right. Take care.
You too.
You too.